This is The Road Show, and I'm your host, David Warren. On today's program, our special guests are husband and wife team, John and Lisa Bevere. Now, they're here to discuss a book that took them 2 lifetimes to write, entitled The Story of Marriage. We're going to talk about their marriage, your marriage, and even the future marriages represented by you, our listening audience. At this time, let's welcome back the dynamic duo, and this time together, John and Lisa Bevere. Good to have you all with us today.
Great to be with you, David.
It's great to be with you, David.
Well, we are going to talk about your new book entitled The Story of Marriage, and this is quite a unique cover that you all have. The book is white, and there's a big round green circle with a bunch of smaller circles inside. What does this represent?
Well, it's a cross-section of a tree trunk, and you can't really tell the story of a tree from the outside, but when you take a tree and you get the cross-section of the trunk, you can actually tell the years. You can actually, somebody that is much more skilled at reading these rings would tell you what was a year of famine, what was a year of abundance, if there had been an attack of pestilence. It would be able to tell every ring as a story. But the truth is, every marriage goes through those kind of seasons. And every year can be different, but at the end of the day, we want our marriages to be trees of life. We want them to be shelters for people. We want people to get fruit from our marriages. And so we just wanted to do this cross-section, and of course we have really artistic people that work for us that did these wood blocks and just said, hey, let's just talk about what the story of a marriage looks like.
And just like a tree, a marriage should be stronger as time goes by.
Absolutely. Increase in width and depth.
And, an expert in dendrology is somebody that can, when we look at a tree, we basically learned in class, you can count how many years the tree has lived by just looking at the rings. But an expert can look at those rings and tell you about each of the different seasons, what happened in those years, the struggles that tree went through, where there was a lot of rain or just a little bit of rain. And so in actuality, those struggles many times is what strengthens that tree.
Chapter 1 of The Story of Marriage is entitled The Original Plan, and you all write, before we dive into the story of marriage, let's take a moment to explore its purpose. What is the purpose of this thing we call marriage?
Go ahead, Lisa.
Well, we really believe that God created marriage to actually tell the story of how He relates to His church, how He relates to His people, how He relates to His bride. And that it is actually an unpacking of what is supposed to be an intimate relationship. And I think it's really unique, David, that everything in our culture right now is attacking the definition of marriage. They're saying, oh, you know what, we need to broaden the definition of marriage. We need to change the definition of marriage. But it was God who created marriage, and if He's the one who created it to actually express how He loves His people, then who are we to recreate that definition? And so, we just felt like it was really important to say, it doesn't matter what I think, it doesn't matter what John thinks, it doesn't matter what the media thinks, it doesn't matter what anybody thinks. The creator of something is the only one that has the right to define it.
Why do you think the definition of marriage is being tampered with, in your opinion?
Well, I think it is being tampered with, and I think that we need to say why. Why are they attacking that? And it's interesting because it's not just the definition of marriage, we're also attacking gender and gender roles. And, I think that there needs to be some expansion. I think there's been a lot of limitations and even dishonoring of both the male and female role in life. But there's a spirit of marriage that's in everybody, whether they're married or not. There is something that, Jesus is talking to His bride, which His whole body would have to have this spirit of marriage within them, which, the book of Malachi talks about guard the spirit of marriage within you. But I do think it's being tampered with. I do think people are trying to be their own gods. I think they're trying to set the parameters and say, we have the right to recreate what God created. And Jesus was very, very clear that it was an organic union that God created and that nobody should desecrate His art. Now, I'm quoting and paraphrasing the Message when Jesus is being confronted, and I think John actually has that in front of him where he can read it. But, yeah, I do think it's being tampered with. I think it's being demeaned. And, I love what Rick Warren said. He said, listen, it's our word. And, it's supposed to be male and female. Marriage is a man and a woman. If they want to call it civil union, if they want to call it something else, a partnership, but marriage has always been about one man, one woman, and one heart.
And what do you think, John?
Well, Jesus made the statement, I'm going to read it. Haven't you read in your Bible that the Creator, and this is from the Message, it's Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 6. He said, haven't you read in your Bible that the Creator originally made man and woman for each other, male and female? And because of this, a man leaves father and mother and is firmly bonded to his wife, becoming one flesh, no longer two bodies, but one. Because God created this organic union, I think that's an excellent word that Eugene Peterson uses here, of the two sexes. No one should desecrate his art by cutting them apart. If you look at, Jesus refers to marriage as God's art, and I love that because, if we look at Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa.
DiCaprio's an actor.
Yeah, I almost said Leonardo DiCaprio. If you look at Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, can you imagine if some kids got some spray paint and just started spraying and vandalizing that? I mean, every single news media in the world would pick that story up, would broadcast it. I mean, Da Vinci would practically roll over in his grave, and we would be outraged because of that art being desecrated. And when you look at marriage, God originally designed it. It was the very first thing he instituted. It wasn't a ministry, it was a marriage. And God designed that marriage, and he knew to be a beautiful representation of Jesus and his bride. And so when we mess and we tamper with the institution of marriage that God designed, we're not only affecting relationships between males and females, between males and males or whatever, we're affecting and desecrating the relationship between Christ and his church, because it's a beautiful portrayal of what marriage is meant to be. Marriage is a portrayal, of our relationship with Christ. And so I agree with what Lisa said. It's so powerful the way she said it. We would expect the world to use a different word if they're going to call it a civil union or something like that, but it can't be a marriage because God is the one that defined marriage.
All right, I'm going to read some interesting quotes that I found interesting from chapter 1 of the story of marriage, and I'll just throw it out there for you all to comment. First of all, what we have learned is that marriage is not as much about finding the right person as it is about being the right person. So It all starts with me.
Absolutely. I think so many people are looking for a perfect person, and there is no such thing. And, the thing is, though, that you do find people that bring out your best and actually bring out your worst. I remember when John and I first got married, we were both kind of like, wait a minute, you're staying here. Like, I used to go out to movies with you, we used to go out to dinner, and now actually I'm annoyed by you constantly being here. I kind of want you to leave. But the truth is, what annoyed me about John and what annoyed John about me were things in our lives that only marriage could refine, only marriage could bring to the surface of constant contact with somebody. And so most people are thinking, if I could find that perfect person, then they'll make me perfectly happy. And there is no such thing. And also the other thing I think that is really crucial is when you make a covenant of marriage, it isn't about saying, I'm going to love you if you're always perfect. It's not saying I'm going to always feel love for you. It's actually, I'm going to always choose to love you. And I think that a lot of people have lost that kind of commitment. John's father just recently went home to be with the Lord, and his parents, how long were your parents married, babe?
66 years.
Wow.
And just the dedication, of we're going to stay consistent. We're going to do the right thing, even if we get the wrong response. We're just committed to one another. They just lived a life in front of their children of commitment and faithfulness and loyalty. And I think so many people right now are living by their feelings. I don't feel in love. I don't feel this way. I want somebody to make me feel different. Well, you actually need to find out who you are. You need to discover what your strengths are, who you are in God, and then actually choose according to this is who I am. This is who I am rightly related to God. This is who I am in my right mind. This is who I am when I am doing what I'm created to do. Now, who is the person that actually can come alongside of that and I can add strength to, instead of thinking, what will this person do for me?
That's great. You all right, if you are struggling in your relationship with your spouse, self-centeredness is probably the source of the problem. That'll preach.
That is absolutely true.
That is beyond a shadow of a doubt the truth right there.
Basically when you marry somebody, you sign up to serve them the rest of your life. That's what you're basically doing. And I think that needs to be considered before you consider what she looks like, her physical shape, his body, his person. You need to say, am I willing to serve this person, lay my life down for this person the rest of my life? And then what I get in return, that's going to be great. That's just wonderful. But, when Jesus came, he chose to die for us before we responded to him. And, he gave himself completely for us and said, I love them. I'm going to serve them. He ever lives to make intercession for us. Long before we responded to his love, he was making intercession for us. And I think when you go into a marriage with that attitude, I'm going to serve my spouse the rest of my life, then what happens is your expectations are at a place where you're not going to be so easily offended. I think what we do is we set up ourselves to be offended by our spouses because we have expectations. Well, she should behave like this. She should give me this. She should do this for me. When in reality, we should be thinking, how can I serve this person and bring the best out in this person as my life partner? When both people think that way, you have an amazing marriage. If one person thinks that way, you've got a decent marriage. If both think selfishly, you've got a marriage that's heading for a train wreck.
I will just say, just being open here, David, when I first got married to John, I actually thought he could do no wrong. I was like, oh my gosh, I do have the perfect person. I wasn't trying to be the perfect person. I thought I had found the perfect person. But then what happened was a couple of months into my marriage, I was like, well, actually, there are some things that need to change. And if he could just change these three things, then he would be the perfect person. And I think a lot of people get into a marriage and all of a sudden they begin to see the flaws, in close proximity, and then their goal becomes to change that person. And the truth is that my husband had a vision of his own, visions of a sweet, supportive, submissive wife, and we started fighting like you cannot believe. John is Irish, Dutch, and Italian, and I am Sicilian, Apache Indian, French, and a teeny bit of English just for sanity. And the truth is, when we had fights, we had WWF wrestling fights. And it was absolutely ridiculous. But we had two people using the Word of God to beat one another up and try to change one another. And the truth is, you don't change or build a good marriage by attacking one another's weaknesses. You do it by actually affirming one another's strengths. And we had to learn that the hard way. We spent the first 4 years fighting, the next 4 years living in the aftermath, and at about year 8, we've been married 33 years, about year 8, we started to rise up and begin to build. And I just think a lot of people never go to the rise and build season.
Well, let's go back to the very beginning when you both thought each other was perfect. Where and how did you all meet?
Well, I was in my final semester at Purdue University, and I had gotten saved my sophomore year. One of my fraternity brothers came and shared Campus Crusades 4 Spiritual Laws with me, and I immediately gave my life to Jesus and began to serve him. And I started an all-campus Bible study for fraternity and sorority people. And so my very, very last semester, my wife was, I'd met her, and I remember when I saw her the first time, I actually was during the summer session. I thought she was the most beautiful girl I'd ever laid eyes on, and I just whispered a prayer. I said, God, please let my wife look like that. She's so beautiful. And so the next day I saw her, and I met her at the lunch table or at the breakfast table. She was sitting with a girl I knew, and I said to the girl, introduce me to your friends. And Lisa was just talking about partying and all this stuff, and I thought, wow, that's probably one of the wildest girls I've ever seen. I thought she's in another world. So I didn't have any interest in getting to know her anymore. But I kept seeing her sit alone at the table, so I'd come over and sit with her. And, well, one time she went up to a guy and she said, I need to talk to somebody about God. I think my mom's kind of in a cult. And her mom wasn't. But the guy said, you need to talk to that man over there. I happened to be walking across. And she said, oh, that guy. And so I remember, she's saying, I think I'm concerned about my mom. And I said, well, listen, we've got a Bible study picnic. Why don't you come? And she came. And during the Bible study picnic, she saw, when he sees me, he sees not me, he sees Jesus. And it
was like one of the, back in the days in the early 80s when the music was really bad, we were all in a house, one person on a guitar, we were singing. And, David, I was a college student, and, a couple of the people there at the sing-along were, like, raising their hands. And I was like, what the heck is happening here? Do they have a question? This is not a hard song. We were singing, like, I got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart.
Right.
And then there was this one song that was a little bit more difficult called Robes of Righteousness. And they were singing the song, and I turned to John and I said, is this really true that God could ever look at me and not see me? Because I knew that I needed a covering. And so then John took me out on the campus that night and shared with me basically from Genesis to Exodus, and I began to panic because I had seen the end part of the movie A Thief in the Night, and I thought there's going to be a rapture, people's heads are going to be cut off, and I'm going to be left behind. And so I interrupted him. I said, I want to do this Christian thing, and he just was like, I'm not done. And so he kept preaching. I was panicking. Finally, he said, well, you just need to pray and just say, I'm a sinner. And I was like, I can so say that. And so on my first date with John, I got born again, I got filled with the Holy Spirit, and I got healed. Because, David, I didn't know the gospel. When John said to me, you're saved now, I said, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. And he said, it means you're whole again, spirit, soul, and body. And I said, so I can have cheese now? And he was like, what? And I said, you just said I could be whole. And I had not had dairy products for years. And so he was like, God, I don't know what she's talking about, but if you can save her, you can heal her. And I got all of that happen first date, and I thought, hey, a year and a half later, I need to marry this guy. This is awesome.
Well, she actually told her mom that morning, she said, I'm going to marry that guy. And her mom said, no, you're just attracted to him because he led you to Jesus. She said, no, Mom, I'm not attracted to him. I felt like God said he's my husband. I'm glad she's attracted to me now.
That's the one sentence I wish I would never have said.
I think it's the funniest sentence. But no, how many husbands get the privilege of leading their wife to salvation? And it's certainly a privilege I thank God for. But it's not something we recommend, missionary dating, they call it. But, it's just the way God had done it for us. I hadn't been out with a girl for a year and a half, but I said, God, I really don't want to date again until you bring my wife. And it was so funny to me that God kept prompting me to keep speaking to Lisa, and then when she became saved, keep going out with her. And so that's how we came together.
The girl at the lunch table.
The girl at the lunch table.
He gave you the very much edited version. I had a bikini top on and cut off shorts that I had slid up to the waistband. So I was obviously drawing attention to myself, but it was obviously up until that point attracting the wrong kind of guys. So I was definitely not trying to be the right person at the time.
Well, John and Lisa Bevere are our guests on today's Road Show, and reading from their book, The Story of Marriage, they say, there have been many times in our marriage when we have preferred to cut ties. It seemed like all hope was gone, but after being married for over 30 years, we are happier today than we've ever been, and we look forward to the next 30 years with hope and expectation. Well, I'm David Warren, your host on today's program, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the importance of writing a vision for your marriage. The Beveres and I will be back after this.
The Road Show is a listener favorite, which airs each weekday here on the Oasis Radio Network, starting at 1 p.m. Eastern, 12 noon Central. The Road Show also has a great section on our website, oasisnetwork.org. There you'll find audio archives of select past interviews, plus guest lineup, and contact information and links to our Roadshow sponsors and its hosts. So join us for the Roadshow, whether on your radio or on your computer at oasisnetwork.org.
Oasis Roadshow.
Well, on today's program, John and Lisa Bevere are here, and we're having a road show together, and we're talking about the story of marriage, their marriage, your marriage, and future marriages represented by you, our listeners, today. And I gotta say, guys, after having interviewed John many times, and Lisa's been on the road show many times, I don't know why it did, but it surprised me that you all wrote a book on marriage. Should it surprise me?
Well, here's the real reason.
Forced us.
Our staff asked us for years, and we said no. But the reason we said yes was we both looked at each other and said, marriages have been under attack for years, but now the very institution of marriage is under attack. And that's why we thought it was our responsibility as ministers of the gospel to bring out, our story in light of the Word of God, which would be most people's stories for marriage. And it's important because marriage is so important to God. It's the first institution that he brought forth, even before there was ever a ministry, before there was ever a business. It was marriage. And I think everybody in the ministry needs to address it nowadays with the way the institution, the very definition of it, is being attacked.
Well, and I also found it to be kind of disturbing, David, that most of the marriage books that we found or curriculums that were done, they were predominantly just the men. And some of them we felt like were really legalistic. We felt like some of them were saying things like, if you want to have a good marriage, it needs to look like ours. You need to build a 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath, and that is the only way a marriage can be right. If your wife works out of the house, you're cursed. It needs to look like us. It needs to be just like, and I was horrified by that because I believe that God actually gives us creative license. We all use the same raw materials, but we have the freedom to build our marriages according to our season of life, according to our purpose and our preference. So we use things like respect and we use things like love and we have foundations. But if somebody wants to build a 1-bedroom, 1-bath, they have the freedom to do that. If the wife wants to work out of the house and the husband stays home with the kids, they have the freedom to do that. It is their choice as a couple to make. And I think that's why, God has very specific elements he says to build with, but he doesn't say how to build it. And I think too many people were getting in people's business, and we feel like we've made a lot of poor choices that people can learn from, but we also found out after 33 years, looking back, we've done some certain things well. And I want to preference the word well, not perfectly, but healthily, which means we learn from our mistakes and rose up and built. And we do have a unique challenge, and we have John is very strong and very wired a certain way and has a very unique dynamic on his life. And then I have that too. And a lot of times you kind of have a very visible husband, very hidden wife, very visible wife, very hidden husband. And we felt like we had a unique dynamic that we could talk to people about when both people are strong.
Well, speaking of strong people, you all are both strong authors. You've sold many, many books separately, and here you have written the story of marriage together. How did you collaborate on this?
That's where we've discovered we're two totally different people in the way we prepare.
John. Yes.
Lisa's a little bit more fly by the seat of your pants, and I'm a little bit more structured and studied out. And I remember it was a challenge for our marriage just to prepare this.
Well, we locked ourselves in a hotel room together, and that was possibly a mistake. So what we ended up doing was writing things separately and then turning it over to our firstborn son to coordinate the merging of it. And it was funny because there was a point where he said, Mom and Dad, I got this really random paragraph from somebody, and I'm not sure. And I said, why would you even ask if it's random? It's not for your dad. It's totally me. But this is where we found out we have very different strengths. And this is what needs to happen. In a healthy marriage, both the man and a woman has a voice. The man has the final input, and he wants to draw out wisdom from his wife. He doesn't want to shut her down and say, I'm the boss and you have to listen to me. He wants to listen to her and then make the best informed decision so that she feels heard, she feels understood, then she's going to feel safe. But yeah, it was it was actually very humorous. It wasn't much of a crisis as it was humorous.
Well, let's go on to chapter 2, and I love the concept behind this. And so everybody take note, listen up to this. You say begin your marriage with the end in mind. Let's talk about that.
Well, let's put it like this. Have you ever heard of a business being successful without first having a business plan? Have you ever heard of a house that could be built without having blueprints? Somebody says, yeah, I could build a house. Well, you really had the blueprint in your mind. Jesus talks about sitting down and counting the cost. So here's what we've observed with people in marriage is that they'll spend hundreds of hours planning for the first day of the marriage. That's the beginning. And they're hoping for this happily ever after, but they don't plan for it. So in other words, the lady will spend 40 hours possibly, 30, 40 hours looking just for the dress. But yet after marriage, the first week, second week, or even before, we won't talk about what the middle's going to look like and the end's going to look like. So what Lisa and I did is we were unconsciously led to do this by the Holy Spirit. We went to a little Chinese restaurant down the road right after we got married, and we literally wrote down on a napkin what we wanted our marriage to look like and our family to look like. So we wrote down how we were going to raise our kids, how we were going to do life together, and we both have goals for our marriage. And so, God even said that Jesus was the lamb slain from the foundations of the world. He saw the end, and he went back and started it from the beginning. And that's why from the beginning he knew Jesus would be the lamb slain. And because he foresaw everything that was going to happen and what it was going to take to build a beautiful family. And I think because we are the children of God, we have the ability to be able to sit down and prophetically, by the help of the Holy Spirit, talk about where we're going, using godly principles, using things that are in our heart, because God says he's put eternity in our heart. Well, it's not just my heart, it's Lisa's heart, and our hearts being merged together as one, God says. So that means she's going to have an aspect of what our life is supposed to look like that I don't have, and I'm going to have an aspect of what our life's supposed to look like that she doesn't have. And so as we sit down, we start talking these things. And if you remember, in Malachi, God says, those who feared the Lord sat down, talked to one another, and a book of remembrance was written. That book of remembrance is God saying, okay, they've written these things down. They've talked about these things. This is the way it's going to be because I put that in their heart to say it. And so it's a beautiful, beautiful thing when we consider our middle and our end.
Lisa, I think, I would venture to say that most marriages represented by our listeners today do not have a written vision for their marriages.
And I think you're right.
Now, is it too late? Can we start now?
Absolutely. I mean, and they don't have to be, this is not a stress attack. I mean, this is exciting. This is, honey, you know what? I just realized we need to plan for the end. Where do we want to land? What do we want it to look like? And then the two of them, they can go on a date or they can do it every night when they go to bed and say, let's just talk about this. Because if they don't have that Google pin drop, they're just going to be all over the place. So they need to know, where are we going with this? And it'll affect the way they spend money. It'll affect the way they spend time. It'll affect the relationships they invest in. It'll affect the way they, invest in their children. If they say, hey, we want a marriage where we want our kids to be around us later. We don't want them to feel like they are, oh, thank God, we're 18, let's get out of the house and run away. Then you're going to actually have to build a different marriage. So we said, okay, we're going to do a lot of life around the table. We're going to force our children to play cards with us. We are going to make relationships with our teenagers, no matter how difficult that is. We're going to engage them in conversation. We're going to make ourselves available. John and I travel a lot on the weekends, so that meant weeknights needed to look different than, a lot of other people's weeknights that maybe don't have their times punctuated. They don't, they have so much time that they actually are too casual with it. And I think that's it. Happily ever after does not happen by accident. It has to have intent. And so I think that we map some stuff out, but it's really about dreaming. That's what we were doing. We were dreaming. We were saying, what do we want this to look like? And we looked at John's parents, and there were certain things we said, man, we want to borrow that. We want to do that as well. And then we looked at my parents, and we were like, we don't want to do any of that. That's all wrong.
Okay.
We're not doing adultery. We're not doing alcoholism. We're not doing unforgiveness. What do we want to bring? And so we had to map some stuff out and say, we want to do it new. And I think everybody, if God says his mercy is new every morning, and that hope is a constant anchor for us, then people need to give themselves license to begin again.
I love your frankness, Lisa Bevere. All right, John.
I do too.
John, that's one of the great characteristics of your wife, John. In the book, The Story of Marriage, you all lay out 5 practical steps that marriage is represented today by our listeners. They can follow this marriage plan. So everybody, I hope you have your pencil and pen ready. What are the 5 practical steps to writing a marriage plan, John?
Well, the first thing you need to do is pray. You need to pray together, pray individually, and you need to ask God to place his thoughts in you. I mean, he's already promised that he's put eternity in our hearts, and God knows the end from the beginning. So God can start formulating your thoughts If we say commit your works to the Lord and he'll cause your thoughts to be established, Proverbs 16:3, he'll start causing your thoughts to start getting in line with what he wants. For example, in the very beginning, I looked at Lisa and I said, we're called to ministry. I don't want to do this alone. I want to be a part of a team. I want you and I to minister together. Well,
and David, there wasn't examples of that back then.
There wasn't.
In 81, there was not a lot of that.
But that was just in my heart. And so from prayer, I really wanted to be a teammate with my wife. And so I started speaking that, even though Lisa threatened my life if I'd get her up in front of a group to speak when I was a youth pastor. She literally gave me a week that was miserable because I announced she was going to speak, because Lisa had her eye removed when she was 5 years old and got out of speech and debate in high school because it was a handicap and I shouldn't have to get up in front of people. But yet I saw so much in her. And so,
and I would say I'm not some package deal. Just because you're the youth pastor doesn't mean I have to do anything. I'm not paid on staff. I don't need to do this. And John would just say, you know what, Lisa, you're not your own. You were bought with a price. And I'd be like, you don't talk to me like I'm some congregation. I'm your one-eyed wife. You need to feel sorry for me, not make me be uncomfortable. You need to be like, and I was pregnant. And I was like, listen, I'm for breeding. I'm for background. Do not force me to do this. But John had such a revelation that the young girls in our youth group needed the voice of a mother, as well as he saw the gift. And, one thing I want to say, because, John said start with prayer. I got a Facebook message this week, and it's amazing to me that couples who are not uncomfortable naked and having sex together are incredibly awkward praying together. They said, we've been married 7 years, and we don't know how to pray together. And I think maybe everybody's putting too much pressure on one another of performance. It's just starting and just joining hands and saying, God, we want to honor you with our lives. We want to honor you with our family. We want to honor you with our marriage. We believe that you are the author of the desires of our heart. God, we give you room to be glorified in our lives. That could be the beginning of the whole prayer.
Let me ask this. Lisa, how did you change? I mean, you have no fear in talking to us today on the radio.
Yeah,
and of course
he did drop a bomb there. First and foremost, my husband kept creating a dynamic where he would trick me into speaking. And I would see that God would speak through me on behalf of the people. And I actually, David, I actually had to come to the place where I was like, you know what, this really isn't about me anymore. This is about, there are people out there that lack comfort. And God has done something significant in my life, and he has set me free so that I can be a blessing to other people. And it doesn't really matter whether this is comfortable for me or not. And here's what I've learned. People truly identify with us in our weaknesses. So I didn't get up with some amazing teaching. I basically would get up and say, you guys, this is terrifying for me. But I've also learned that when I face what I fear, I become fearless. And, God actually is creating dynamics for people where he's not really interested in the areas where we are strong and we don't need him. He's interested in anointing the areas where we are weak so he can show himself strong. And so, so that was definitely something. But I mean, it was terrifying for me.
So we start out with praying.
Yeah.
And what that causes is our thoughts to become in line with where we're going. So in other words, Lisa and I weren't talking about, hey, let's have a business of, selling retail clothing. We were talking about ministry. And then the second step is you collect inspiration. It could be scriptures, articles, stories, photos, song lyrics, magazine clippings.
Pinterest.
But here's where our inspiration came from. We started searching for couples that were doing it together. And they were few and far between back in the early and mid-'80s. And so when we found a couple that was doing it together, we latched on. I mean, one was T.L. and Daisy Osborne. We were so admiring of the way they ministered together all over the world and did these big crusades. And so we just kept looking for couples. Whenever we saw just a man who was ministering and the wife was at home, she was out of the scene, not talked about and all that.
And there's seasons for that. We're not mocking that.
But we weren't drawn to that because God had already put it in our heart to minister as a team, to minister, for Lisa to have a unique voice and for me to have a unique voice. So our inspiration was finding couples that reflected of where we were going. It wasn't an exact pattern, but it reflected the pattern of where we were going. Mm-hmm. So that could happen. And then the third step is go somewhere where you can dream. And I mentioned that ours was the little Chinese restaurant down the road where we would write things down. And
it felt exotic and otherworldly, and
it was
cheap.
international. Yeah. I mean, and here we are today. We've given millions of resources into the nation of China. So, and we've been over to Asia so many times ministering to the Chinese people. So it's kind of cool. But if you look at number 4 is to identify your goals. So what are some of your goals? You got to dream big. I know that, a big goal for me was providing for my family. I wanted my house paid for. I didn't want to be in debt. I didn't want to have cars with debts. And I didn't want to, put a financial burden or strain on our family. I wanted to be able to minister the way God had called us to minister as far as a goal goes. So I started then looking for people who traveled because I realized that God had called us to travel. And I started asking them questions and things like that. And then, of course, you have your goals for your marriage. I know I can tell you what my number one goal is for our marriage. My number one goal is that when Lisa leaves this earth, she will love me more than the day she walked down the aisle and said, I do. My number 2 goal is that when I leave this earth, I'll love her more than the day I walk down the aisle. Do we have challenges with that? You better believe it, but they're not brick walls to us. They're speed bumps.
And there was a time that I actually told my husband, you know what, I don't want to live with you in heaven. I mean, that was like, we went through like 5 years of a
real
really,
hardship.
Really, but, the thing is we were committed. We were committed to one another, and again, we had an end in mind. And, he has all these ministry goals, and coming from parents twice divorced, David, my goal was I want my kids to have friends that come to our house. I want our house filled with laughter. Mm-hmm. I want a ping pong table. I want our house to be the place other people can come.
Right.
And I want our house not to be fancy. I want it to be functional. And so there was, those were the kind of things that you get from a woman that you might not get from a man. And so that's why you need both people to weigh in on it.
All right, so the 5 practical steps to write a marriage plan as outlined in the Bevere's book, The Story of Marriage. Number 1, pray. Number 2, collect inspiration.
Yep.
Number 3, go somewhere where you can dream. Number 4, identify your goals. And then number 5, determine how to reach them. Before I tell our listeners how they can order this book and we go to another break, John, what's it like knowing what your wife was like back in the early days when it was hard to even get her to get up in front of the youth group, and when you sit in the audience and there are thousands of people just soaking in the word, how it's being delivered by your very unique wife, one Miss Lisa Bevere? What's it like for you?
I'm in awe. I'm in awe of what God can do with a person who comes to the table with a severe handicap, and rightfully so. If there's anybody that could have really, really said, hey, I need to stay out of the public life. It's somebody that has a prosthetic eye and went through the trauma of losing their eye when they were 5 years old. They could have easily become a person that says, I'm going to have a very private life. And you know what? Most of us, sympathy would have said that. But there was a driving force in me, and I can only say now I know it was the Holy Spirit that kept saying, get her out in front of people, get her out in front of people. Don't give her a choice. I mean, she would keep me up till 3 a.m. Now I sit there, and I'm in awe of how God literally would drive me to encourage her and bring that out in her. And I'm in awe of the millions of people, actually, that she has touched now, years later. And it absolutely gives such glory to God. And you just stand there and shake your head and go, wow, this is what God has for every marriage, David. Every single wife, she's got a gold mine in her husband, and every single husband's got a gold mine in their wife. And if they would just learn how to bring that out, they would see amazing things that they never thought they'd imagined seeing before when they were single.
Well,
and one of the things, and I know that we're running out of time, but one of the things that Jesus said, talking about marriage, he's talked about that not everyone is mature enough to live a married life. And this is in Matthew 19, and it says, it requires a certain aptitude and grace. Marriage isn't for everyone. Some from birth seemingly never give marriage a thought. Others never get asked or accepted. And some decide not to get married for kingdom purposes. And then Jesus says, but if you're willing to grow into the largeness of marriage, do it. And I think that's what John is saying. He forced me into a larger world. that was not what I was looking for, but our marriage enlarged one another, and we do think marriages sometimes end up shrinking the man and shrinking the woman, and they're really supposed to multiply both of them.
I love that. The name of the book is The Story of Marriage by today's guests, John and Lisa Bevere. It is available wherever books are sold, plus online through their website, messengerinternational.org, and also through the website Amazon.com. They have some other resources we'll talk about before we say goodbye. But when we do come back after this final break, I want to ask John and Lisa how writing a book on marriage has had an impact on their own marriage. Back for the wrap-up after this. I'm David Warren, Program Director at Oasis Radio Network and one of the hosts of this podcast. All of our hosts enjoy hearing from you, our listening family, so drop us a note. Our email address is roadshow@oasisnetwork.org. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and you'll receive new episodes on your mobile devices. And now, back to the show. Today's guests, John and Lisa Bevere, are best-selling authors and the co-founders of Messenger International. They have been married for more than 30 years, and they want their struggles and triumphs to enrich and protect the story of marriage for others. John and Lisa are speaking with us by phone today from their home in Colorado Springs. I'm David Warren, your host, and we've only gone through chapters 1 and 2. There are 6 chapters plus in this book, but we all agreed during the break that we don't want to say goodbye without touching on chapter 3 about clearing the decks. And you all have conferences where you speak to couples on this subject of marriage. We're discussing your new book, The Story of Marriage. And this particular subject brings tears to people's eyes. So let's discuss in our remaining time clearing the decks. John and Lisa.
Well, first of all, we got to define it. Clearing the decks means to prepare for a particular event or goal by dealing with anything beforehand that might hinder progress. And so this really came from back in the times when there were warships, and they would saw a battle coming, and they would clear off the decks so that way people wouldn't trip, they wouldn't fall over, they wouldn't have been hurt. And so when we come into our marriage, we got to clear the decks because inadvertently we're going to be bringing something into that marriage. We might be bringing an offense. We might be bringing family curses that have gone back from generations. We might be bringing in extreme selfishness or whatever. And so before we can really build a strong, healthy marriage, we got to take care of these things that would cause us to trip and hurt ourselves. And so one of the biggest ones is offense. And, of course, I think when we came into our marriage, I want to just, Lisa can speak so well to this, but I want to set this up. I mean, I'm marrying a wife who her father has just left her mother for a younger woman right at the time we're getting married. And, her mother's been married twice, her grandmother 4 times. So, of course, there's a lot of disappointment.
We were dysfunctional before it was popular.
Yeah, so there's a disappointment with the male race right there. And so, there was an immediate wall that we didn't even know about it until things started happening a few months into our marriage that we realized, okay, wait a minute. I'm getting accused of doing something here that I really didn't do. What's going on here? And, of course, the deck hadn't been cleared yet.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say it was so much that he was being accused. It was I related to him according to the men that I knew.
That's a better way of saying it.
And I would say that I actually didn't realize I was doing it, but that would mean that I was always the first one to push away, and I reserved. I was reserving a portion of my heart. I did not love John fearlessly. I loved him with a lot of fear. And, fear and love do not coexist.
Right.
I loved him with measure. I was afraid, to give him all of my heart, because if I gave him all of my heart and he left me, then I felt like I would have nothing. So I unintentionally reserved some stuff. And I also was very intolerant of mistakes. I think when women are afraid, then they're very intolerant of mistakes. And, we had an opportunity to do an interview recently, and I said 2 things I wish I would have done early on was I would have loved John fearlessly, and I would have allowed him to make more mistakes. And that sounds crazy, but we all grow out of our mistakes. And the truth is when you are one heart, even the mistakes become actually a strength later on.
John?
Well, I know this, that into our marriage, I'd go to hug Lisa, and she would literally start pushing back. And one day, I just looked at Lisa, and I said, hey, babe, I'm not your dad. I'm not our first pastor, because our first pastor left his wife for a younger woman. I said, I am committed to you. My parents had been married at that time. I think it was 45 years. I said, I'm going to be with you the rest of my life. And I said, are you going to wait until we're 70 years old to enjoy me fully? If you do, you're going to miss a whole lot of fun. But I'm still going to be here either way. And I think that at that point she realized, oh my gosh, there's a stumbling block here that I keep falling over, and and my husband's not it. It was, the behavior of my dad, my first pastor. And so people don't realize, but you bring these fears in. You bring these, maybe curses in. It may be, drinking, it may be pornography, it may be all of this. And all of this has to be addressed before you can really build a healthy foundation and put up the structure of a healthy family and home. And so in this book, we really deal with all these different areas. We deal with the offense. We deal with opening up your spirit. People close their spirits. If you look at Paul talking about the Corinthians, your hearts are closed to us. He was like, I can't help you. I love you. I want to love you, but you can't receive my love because you've closed your hearts. Well, people close their spirits in marriage because of offense. You've got in-laws that intrude. The Bible talks about a man leaving his father and mother, new authority lines being set up. We had one of our parents that was trying to control our marriage and run our marriage, and it took having to confront that. That was something that had to be cleared off. There are curses that are brought in that, alcoholism and other things maybe, like I said earlier. And so all of these things we walk through one after another in this book, where there's also unrealistic expectations. David, Hollywood portrays this image of what marriage is supposed to look like, and it's unrealistic. And so what happens is the woman or the man may come into this marriage expecting a Hollywood marriage, and all of a sudden their expectation's wrong, and they just wake up to, oh my gosh, what's going on here? I've got a terrible marriage. When in reality, you don't. You have an opportunity to be able to grow. One of the things that we point out in this book is that God says, what do I want from a marriage? I want sons and daughters of God. And I don't think he's just talking about physical offspring. I think what he's talking about is nobody gets closer to you than your spouse. And what happens is your spouse gets to see the flaws that are in you, and your flaws get exposed to your spouse. And so that gives an opportunity for you to say, okay, I really am selfish. Okay, I really am this. I am that. I'm hot-tempered. God, I'm asking you, please get this out of me. Because God will not remove things unless we ask him to remove them. And so when I'm getting very, very close to Lisa and I realize all of a sudden, okay, I'm really selfish in this area, or I've been selfish with my children, or I refuse to say I'm sorry to my children, all of a sudden I go, God, I'm sorry. I've got pride in me from not being able to say I'm sorry. And that ends up becoming a refining tool to me and makes me a better man than if I would have been single and hiding all these flaws from everybody. Does that make sense?
Yes. For sake of time, I would like us to go to the very end of the book, the last chapter entitled Begin Again. And you all write, it's never too late to begin again. If you want to learn to bring out the best in your mate, please find a quiet, private time and place to pray with your spouse. You have a prayer that you pray together, but you have these declarations as well that you say as a husband to your wife, and you as a wife, Lisa, to your husband, in this case, John. So I would like for you to represent the husbands as you speak this out.
So if you're a husband listening right now, you want to be able to look at your wife and say, forgive me for using my strengths to oppress and hold you down. Forgive me for not speaking to your virtue, your beauty, your wisdom, and your kindness. Forgive me for not creating an environment in which you can flourish. Forgive my selfishness in our conversations, our time together, and in our bed. I believe God can heal, restore, and glorify our union. I believe you and I can do anything through him who strengthens us. We will take dominion, multiply, and be very fruitful together in the name of Jesus.
And Lisa, you represent the wives.
Absolutely. Forgive me for using my strengths to point out your weaknesses. Forgive me for dishonoring you and being selfish in our communication. From now on, I'm going to use my words to build your life. Forgive me for the times I was not a safe guardian of your heart. I believe in you, and I believe in us. I believe God can make all things new. I choose to love and forgive you. It is a new day filled with mercy and truth. Let's love and dream again.
That's beautiful. It is from the book, The Story of Marriage by John and Lisa Bevere. Before I tell you how you can order the book, I have one final question for the two of you, and that is, how did the process of writing this book on marriage have an impact on your own marriage?
You know, it was, I think, one of the greatest things I had the privilege of doing, because it caused me to fine-tune, and I saw a lot of flaws in my own things that I had slipped into, selfish patterns, behaviors, and it helped tune up my marriage so much. And that's when I really realized a book's from God. I remember when I wrote The Bait of Satan, I had to go read it years later in the studio, and after reading, I came home and I said, Lisa, I got to call 3 men. And she said, what? I said, I know this book's from God. I got so convicted, and I had to call 3 men and apologize. And I did it. And this is what this did for me, is it really helped me see some of the flaws in my own behavior towards my wife and even my children. So it was a great blessing to me.
You know, and it just confirmed I was perfect, David. I was like, wow, this is so awesome. I always knew I was perfect. No, I'm just kidding. For me, it gave me the license and the realization that we needed to be intentional. We're coming into a new season. We have 4 sons that are pretty much grown, and we have 3 grandchildren, and we thought, you know, we need to add to our story. We need to dream again. There's a new season before us. We're going to soon probably be empty nesters, and what do we want that to look like? And so it was a new opportunity to write some things out and really celebrate God's faithfulness. You know, I think when you have an opportunity to intentionally look back and go, wow, that season was so tough back then, and now it's like a joke. But I know so many couples are in a bad season right now, and they can't imagine ever looking back and laughing. We can. And you can not only laugh at your past, you can laugh at your future if you actually understand that God is the one that is actually cheering you on and saying, let's write an amazing story together.
What a delight to have the dynamic duo with us together on the Road Show, John and Lisa Bevere. Thank you all so much for your time and for writing a resource such as The Story of Marriage. This book.
Thank you for what you do, though.
Thank you, John. This book is available at bookstores, wherever books are sold. Also online retailers such as Amazon.com, and through the website of today's guests, messengerinternational.org. Again, messengerinternational.org. You can order the book there, as well as something called the M Series, which is the book along with teaching DVDs and CDs to enrich your own marriage. Well, as we end today's program, I'm David Warren, and I do believe it's been another great road show. That's my signature sign-off, but I would really like to close today's program by ending with a great quote from the book, The Story of Marriage by John and Lisa, and this is it. A wise woman builds her home, and a wise man builds his woman. As each spouse speaks life to the other's strengths, they enlarge their lives and bring about God's will on earth. We thank you for listening. You've been listening to The Road Show. If you'd like to write to us, here's our address. The Road Show, P.O. Box 1924, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 74101. Our email address is roadshow@oasisnetwork.org. The views of today's guest aren't necessarily those of this station, but we do appreciate and thank our guest for spending this time with us. The Road Show, an Oasis Network presentation.